The experience of watching a truly world historic moment unfold through the windows of your apartment or your house, in your pajamas, is not exactly what we were led to expect. History books made it seem so much more dramatic. And even despite the frustrations with our contemporary political impasses, the elite obstructionism, the spectacular populism that doesn't really seem to go anywhere, we truly have lived through, and in fact are living through, a world historic moment. So many extraordinary measures taken by states previously thought impossible have taken place over the past 18 months. Well over $14 trillion and counting in fiscal measures alone around the globe. And yet all of this seems to confirm the conservative dictum announced in a mid-20th century novel, which was set in the 19th century. Everything must change for everything to remain the same. Welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. It's Thursday, the 26th of August. My name is Alex Hochuli, and as always, I'm with Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare. Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Yo, what's up?
So today we're going to be discussing Adam Tooze's new book, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. It's a book which presents a thrilling narrative on 2020 and early 2021. It's a very present history. It's about the huge crisis responses and the inadequacies of the legacies of 30 years of neoliberalism. It's a book about biological and, by extension, natural threats and biopolitical responses, about oceans of cheap money and the massively expanded role of central banks. It's about national inequalities and global inequalities, about China's Sputnik moment and Western adhocracy. So right now, Phil and myself will be chatting to Adam Tooze, who is Professor of History at Columbia University and Director of the European Institute. He's the author of The Deluge about World War I, Crashed, A History of the 2008 Crisis, and his new book, which is out today, or will be out today when you hear this. So here is Phil and myself talking to Adam about Shutdown.
I'm most of the way through your book. I've enjoyed it.
Oh, excellent.
I completely agree with you on Italy. Have you ever looked at the pictures of, maybe there's even video of Berlusconi's, original housing project development outside Milan?
Oh yeah, like Milano Due, yeah.
Yeah. That is a full JG Ballard right there.
It is, absolutely.
It's amazing with the kind of Minitel style.
Yeah.
Kind of like closed circuit television
terminals.
network.
Yeah.
Inside it's very trick.
Actually, I guess we missed a trick because we do have this kind of Ballardian moment at some point in the book,
yeah,
but didn't tie that together. Actually,
you could have tied it in. Yeah. It's no, he's the works. I mean, he's so. The thing about Berlusconi, I ended up thinking is he's almost too much of an agent, right? I mean, there's a sort of genius to the. He's in a sense too grand a historical actor for the role that you've assigned him to.
That's true. Yeah.
De facto he's the end of whatever he's the end of, but he's actually just he's such a player and he has such a capacious grasp of what the project could be. I think actually far more than Trump.
Absolutely seized on it very early. Yeah,
Trump's just really happy to be on a reality TV show, and that's just about
he's surfing the wave. Yeah,
that's kind of like that's the sum total of it. With Berlusconi, you genuinely get the sense that he's a much more significant cultural, more like a Henry Ford type figure in that sense.
I wonder if that's his connection to Craxi and the socialists, and he's more kind of historically embedded in the end of the First Republic in a way, whereas Trump comes in kind of in a very different period, I guess.
Absolutely, and I don't think. Yes, I think that I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. Trump doesn't really have a connection. I mean, the analogy would be like Trump's links to the Clintons, I guess, right? In the 90s, to the analogy to Craxi.
Yeah. Or to, what's his face, that attorney, Roy Cohn.
Yeah.
The attorney, he was the power broker in New York.
Yeah.
But there's such a gap between that kind of 80s New York world and when Trump kind of comes in on the kind of political scene, whereas I suppose maybe Berlusconi had, like you say, had a bigger sense of himself as closing down First Republic.
Well, and he also, whereas Trump's towers are a kind of aesthetic expression of something or other, right? I mean, Berlusconi's vision in that housing project is so much more comprehensive and original. You could also say, like, you could imagine Trump as a star on a network owned by Berlusconi. See what I mean? Like, Trump doesn't own a network yet.
Hopefully there's enough life in both of them yet that might one day be realized in the next decade.
And you guys can just go bingo.
Yeah, we want like rights to be script consultants on that at the very least.
Exactly, all our ducks in a row at that moment.
All our Christmases
just came at once. I really liked your stuff about democracy as politics. It was a real throwback to me to Deluge, actually. I ended up rather perversely concluding that the absolute high point of European democratic politics was 1916 or 17. But on your grounds, in other words, it's not because it's formally finished or everyone's enfranchised. It's just that, it's to me still astonishing that you can have open strike movements and open parliamentary discussion of peace in the middle of a war, which at that point is consuming the lives of 15 to 20,000 people a day. It's unthinkable in the later, it's unthinkable in World War II. It's completely unthinkable by the time you get to, the wars of our era, where there's just like monolithic consensus that the comparatively trivial military endeavors require like complete closure, home Burgfrieden, complete closure of the home front. Whereas in the middle of World War I, you can actually have gladiatorial parliamentary combat, open protest, and the full register, also a weird combination on the elite side. These are all people with classical educations. So somebody like Clemenceau self-consciously enacts Demosthenes, and he's not messing around. That's literally who he thinks he's embodying. And he speaks, and these people have oratorical skills which are at that level, right? They come out of, deep Western Civ, classically inspired conceptions, and that mixture of mass politics, mass media, huge class mobilization, war as an political issue to be decided in the midst of doing it. Well, it's not surprising it's the Bolshevik moment, but I actually think it's also the high point of democracy in a sense of the whereas most narratives have a very different chronology from that. Anyway, sorry, I thought it was a very interesting passage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's all been downhill since then.
Are you guys inspired by Rancière at all? Then is this coming out?
Yes.
I wasn't checking the footnotes at that point.
Very much so. He was a great kind of influence in terms of framing some of the issues and questions. And I think he was part of a wider moment. I mean, when we were all at grad school, he was very much kind of discussed among those people who are into political theory, such as ourselves. And so, very much so, that kind of typology he developed.
Okay. Oh, good. I just was kind of thinking this strikes me like that. There's that weird use of the democracy. People like Lloyd George use the democracy, not to refer to the constitution, but to the forces of progressive political change.
It's a kind of it's a wonderful kind of anachronism, I think, actually. It sets us up very well, in fact, because one of the contrasts that we wanted to talk about was the way in which, the war on terror, that we're not going to talk about the war on terror, but the war on terror and coronavirus, they don't seem to be predicated on that kind of trade-off where the sacrifice of the citizenry is going to lead to kind of greater enfranchisement or greater benefits for the citizenry. There doesn't seem to be any kind of deal like that, which has been constructed as a result of these political moments. But that's something we can get into.
By all means. Yeah.
Well, shall we get started? So we'll jump right in. We're here to obviously discuss your book, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. When did you actually start writing the book? When did you decide to start writing the book? Because I understand you were working on a different project in early 2020.
Yeah, like most people, I had other plans in 2020. You can say that as many times as you like, and it's still funny. Yeah, I was indeed. I mean, I still am. I'm going back to it now. I mean, I'm writing a book about the political economy of the climate crisis, and but I shifted because I didn't really feel I had any option. What happened is that the narrative of the 2008 crisis, which was itself, of course, distilled out of the analysis produced at the time by journalists, economists, and so on, had been widely read by the commentariat, by journalists, economists, and so on. And so when the financial markets started to collapse on Monday, 9th of March, the repo market began to shake, which is the market where you buy and resell treasuries, US treasury debt. I just was inundated with phone calls, emails from people saying, Adam, can you help us think through this? Can we talk about that? Can you write something about this? And for the first time in my life, because I found myself, as it were, really in immediate real time trying to think through and analyze a major historical shock. I'd begun to do that more and more since the publication of Crashed and my immersion in social media, finance, Twitter, and so on, which began for me relatively recently. I only really started doing that in about 2015, and so this was the first moment where I felt, just compelled by the flow of events to think on my feet in real time. And at some point, it just became impossible to go on writing the climate book and doing this at the same time. I just couldn't handle the psychological stress of it. Duncan Weldon, the great works for The Economist now, has just published his book on British economic history. He joked with me after I published Crash that you're going to have to write an endless new edition, and there I was doing exactly that. So the historical narrative really caught up with me.
So before digging into the book a bit, I was just curious on this point, being a historian, and how you kind of put yourself in the current moment. So you've achieved renown as a historian of imperial and Nazi Germany, and then subsequently the US rise to global power during and after the First World War, and like you mentioned, the global history of the financial crash of 2008. So could you tell us a little bit about the intellectual challenges and difficulties as a historian in coming closer and closer to the present in terms of your analysis?
Well, I think, fundamentally what I'm interested in is history. So the historicity, the experience of living in, navigating in, acting in, thinking in time. And time, as you have talked about in your fascinating book on the end of history, like history isn't just events, and history isn't just the sort of flow of clock time. It's an understanding of those processes as interconnected, as collectively meaningful. Yeah. And I've become more, this is the sort of Hegelian understanding of history and actuality. And I've become, yes, as a professional historian, more and more preoccupied with, as it were, the living experiment of living and understanding actuality in real time. So I don't think of it as any way a sort of unhistorical activity. It's just driven to a kind of an acute sense of consciousness by the fact that it's immediate. And in this case, this is the first time I've ever experienced this. Immediately impacted me personally and my family and those nearest and dearest to me. I mean, my wife's business was basically shut down. My daughter was furloughed. We know dozens of people who've become unemployed as a result of the crisis. I'd never experienced a shock of that type before. And my own health is, slightly precarious in certain ways. So I actually felt a degree of fear that I've not felt before in that immediacy. And so in all of these ways, in that review that Perry Anderson wrote about my work, he said, Tooze thinks starts to describe history in media res, so in the middle of it. And this was that, like nothing I've ever lived in before. And I would insist it was history. I know your guys are kind of skeptical about the idea of history restarting. I really think this is really the beginning of Anthropocenic history collectively experienced, would be my one of the claims I would want to make.
Well, it'd be nice to get onto that in just a little bit, but to go through the book, Let's start with the title. It's an obvious place to start, but it obviously confronts the reader because you've opted for shutdown instead of lockdown. Why is that?
Well, because lockdown is contentious in a way, and to simply, there's nothing wrong with it being contentious. It's just that to simply flatly adopt it as the title, as though it was self-evident, is to miss a interesting question. And so I thought I would take an oblique approach, so as to force the question of why isn't he talking about lockdown? And well, obviously, in the English use of the language anyway, lockdowns before 2020 would have been associated with collective punishments in prisons. That's the obvious association. If you look up the word on Amazon, you'll find loads of ghastly, more or less sadistic prison novels on that theme. And so the term itself implies a kind of politics of this collective action. And what I was interested in was trying to find a term that left open the question of what the politics and power relations in that, let's, for want of a better term, like collective action were. And I don't for a second deny that there are places in the world, notably India, South Africa, in which the term lockdown, in fact, seems entirely appropriate. It was coerced, it was sudden, it was from above, it was enforced with real violence. And friends and folks that I know in Paris describe the situation there at times as well as being lockdown-y. Speaking about New York, it would be entirely inappropriate to describe the situation in New York. We were at the epicenter of the crisis in March and early April, and yet there was no police. I mean, this is a country perfectly capable of exercising police coercion, and by the summer, during the curfews after Black Lives Matter, or in the middle of it, we had police cars driving up and down the street here, ushering people back into their apartments at 8 p.m. or 8:30 or whenever it was in midsummer. So that's what it looks like when you are being locked down. That's not what we experienced in March or April at all. And if you get into the economics of it, the IMF has done, take it or leave it, econometric studies on the process. And the data strongly suggests that the vast majority of the reduction in mobility was produced through voluntary action, self-protective action.
Yeah.
Rather than government fiat.
On that, actually, it's interesting that I guess you could argue that the government response to lockdowns then ended up locking in that initially fearful response from citizens, from consumers. And there's an interesting contrast in the book that you can contrast this demobilization in the West with China's mass mobilization. So one interesting factor I was unaware of, that China enlisted well over 100,000 grid workers per province to monitor, test people, and so on, build hospitals and so on. And that there's a real contrast there between China's mobilization and the West's demobilization.
Yeah, obviously we need a better way of thinking about China than some sort of crude authoritarianism or some sort of top-down dictatorship. And there's a whole variety of other characterizations out there, and I'm not really, I don't have the expertise to arbitrate between them. But at the very least, what we need is an idea of the capacity for various types of mobilization, not comprehensive of the entire population, but of a strategic minority that rallies around the regime in key moments like this and self-activates in ways which Beijing and Xi Jinping then in fact have to begin unraveling by the middle of February, because this impulse to lockdown has become so powerful. And yes, they have been experimenting over the last 10 years with, I think, two different types. I think they're subtly different from each other. One is the implantation of the Communist Party in the fabric of the new urban, prosperous China, so in private housing estates, in co-op boards, as we know, in businesses as well. And then on the other hand, there's also these rather interesting experiments in local government administration, which are, I think, more about the delivery of services in these rapidly expanding cities. And both of those were activated very powerfully from the last week of January. And then there is, as it were, the kind of, China's obviously complex, uneven development. So there's also the sort of localism of Chinese rural life, the villages that shouldn't be shut down and just wouldn't let anyone pass who didn't have the right accent, and quite a lot of regional and ethnic hostility and xenophobia, which was very, very marked towards people from Hubei and Wuhan who have quite strong accents and found themselves on the wrong end of some pretty grievous discrimination. And you can see this through the efforts of the regime to counter-steer, when when Beijing feel it's necessary to issue instructions that, that the ad hoc local decision to shut down a major interstate highway is not fully sanctioned by the party, something's going on. That that this is a typical historian's method. That the prohibition suggests to you that there's an issue there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing which is also interesting in terms of you setting out what the scope of your book is that you say that your intention is to explain the shutdown not as a result of overprotection or as a policy of repression, but as a result of structural tensions. So as we kind of move towards the meat of the book, could you explain what you meant by this?
Well, what I mean is that we ended up doing something staggering. I mean, utterly staggering. And I don't really think we have a very good explanation for why. And I'm not convinced by the simple surveillance capitalism saw it all coming. Well, of course they were going to do that. It's great for Amazon, isn't it? Kind of logic. And I'm not very convinced by the sort of dictatorial state seizing its chance type logic either. It doesn't seem to me a very reasonable characterization of what was happening. I also am not terribly convinced by sort of humanitarian, morality triumphed over the economy type logics. Though something clearly did triumph over the economy, I'm not sure it's morality in any simple sense. So what I wanted to do was describe in that difficult second chapter, as it were, the mechanisms that were in place that would produce. I read the decision to lock down as a sort of desperate flight forward to resolve a set of issues that can't in any simple sense be resolved. So it's simultaneously possible in early March to have, the Prime Minister of Britain openly discussing the famous mayor in the beach resort in Jaws who tries to keep the businesses open, and more or less openly discussing herd immunity on the one hand as a totally rational policy, and at some level it's difficult to deny there's a certain rationality to it, kind of crude rationality to it, and on the other hand to have Governor Cuomo going on television and saying with equal conviction that no life is worth sacrificing for Wall Street. And I think the shutdown logic comes out of the sort of incredibly messy slalom between these positions that liberal regimes have to navigate in that period. And the answer is they don't really have a good way of arbitrating that. I mean, the simple fact that, the economistic solution would be to say, well, let's do a cost-benefit analysis of what we're about to do. And as soon as you do that, people will accuse you of being some sort of mass murdering psycho.
Yeah.
And Trump, I do think, increasingly does begin to sound. I mean, he may have, for many people, of course, and I very much enjoy your what do you call it, neoliberal breakdown syndrome or whatever.
Neoliberal breakdown syndrome.
Yeah, the knee-jerk liberal sort of antipathy for Trump, I don't share. But nevertheless, I do think he begins to seem increasingly deranged as we're saying things like, we've got to sacrifice lives as necessary to restart the economy. Though he never actually quite says that. Some of his outriders do. And then as a historian of World War II, you think, well, why is that crazy? That's the sort of thing you say all the time in World War II. Right? The idea that people would go to work and risk their lives to sustain war production is just obvious. Right? It's not even worth debating in a total war society. So I try to describe the lockdown as resulting, in a sense, from a kind of black hole of governance. I quite like I think this is the sort of thing you'd expect to see where there's no politics there. These are not societies well suited to making, and well habituated even, to making the kind of claims necessary to anchor very difficult decisions.
Yeah, lacking the legitimacy to see them through, even wanting to, even with a will from the top.
Yeah, so not being able to appeal to kind of conventional rhetorics of heroism. Like, why can't you say old people ought to take it on the chin for the economy? Like, you can't say that. It'd be crazy Republicans would say that. And then everyone agrees they're crazy. So that's, as it were, what I'm trying to describe is, as it were, the lockdowns emerging not as carefully calculated cost-benefit policy, but as the last resort, having ended at a place where we really didn't have. And what's really interesting, of course, is that epidemiologists and virologists have told us forever that, they've told us for 50 years, it's a specific learning of modernity that this could happen. Because after all, in the 70s, we thought we'd killed smallpox, it was all over. And yet we still weren't prepared for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's evident. obviously the West's failings make someone else look good, and that's China. And you're right that China's 2020 wasn't a Chernobyl moment, as some had expected. There was no huge crisis of legitimacy for the People's Republic, as there had been for the USSR in 1986. And I mean, that's, I think, quite clear looking back. But do you think, conversely, that 2020 was China's Sputnik moment, or is that too grand, maybe?
No, it's more divisive and difficult than that. I mean, I think the regime would like it to be a Sputnik moment, but I mean, first thing to say is that if we hadn't run, if we hadn't screwed up as badly as we ended up screwing up, this would have gone down as an absolute disaster for Xi Jinping's regime, right? Because this is so much worse than 2003, which itself has gone down in the annals of the Chinese Communist Party as a disaster. It's the worst economic shock that China has suffered since the beginning of the reform period, even though they bounced back faster than everyone else. So if the rest of the world had managed to contain in February, this would have been a profound disaster for the Chinese regime. We hand them the victory. Internally, I think it does feel probably like a Sputnik moment. But the problem, of course, is that this is also the moment in which the antagonism towards China moves from being sort of awed, impressed, jealous, envious kind of monitoring of their GDP growth on, the purchasing power parity adjusted GDP metrics that we're all addicted to one of antagonism. So, it's whereas Sputnik remained very impressed and everyone wanted one too, there was an implicit sense of threat, but it wasn't manifest.
Well, and I guess there wasn't the massive technological breakthrough here. I mean, you do know that China was successful with vaccines and so on to a certain degree, but I guess it's not
the
that
basic level. Yeah. No, it isn't, and it's a triumph. It's a triumph of anything, of a social system rather than a technological prowess.
Yeah, I mean that comes through so strongly throughout the book that as you're going through describing the contradictions and the prevarications of various Western nations, the struggles of emerging markets, and then China just comes in and blows everyone out of the water, kind of repeatedly. There's this kind of scene that plays out across the book. And I mean, to turn, I guess, back to the West, you write that, with regard to these enormous crisis response from leading governments, that while it overturned the nostrums of neoliberalism, notably with regard to the scale of government interventions, it was framed by neoliberalism's legacies in the form of hyperglobalization, fragile and attenuated welfare states, profound social and economic inequality, and the overweening size and influence of private finance. Could you maybe respond to that and explain how all this played out in a what you call a very 21st century fiscal monetary synthesis?
Yeah, so what I'm after here, and it's a not so coded message to my friends on the sort of Green New Deal MMT left in the US and in Britain, is let's by all means register and indeed in some sense celebrate the crisis of the nostrums, in other words, the ideas, the ideology of neoliberalism. But let's not mistake that for a new era or the opening of any great necessarily opportunities for transformative politics. On that basis alone, anyway. Because what is done in the space vacated by the collapse of neoliberal ideology is dramatic. But the condition of possibility for it is precisely as you analyze in your book, the suppression, destruction of the live forces of a contested democracy, which is what forced the creation of independent central banking with a conservative program in the 1980s. I found this incredible quote by Rudiger Dornbusch, one of the truly most influential economists of MIT in the 1980s and 1990s. He literally says, the aim of our project is to end democratic money because all democratic money is bad.
That was a great quote.
It's just staggering. And I don't know why it's only just surfaced, because it's so, in light of the conversations that have been going on for 20 years now, really, about the end of politics and so on, it's just there in crystalline form. And explicitly making explicit the anti-democratic, specifically democratic problem that independent central banks of a 1980s, 1990s variety were designed to supersede. Now, The point is that if those same central bankers with the same intellectual DNA, basically, and certainly the same class DNA, are now embarked on the sort of policies that once they would have anathematized, what are the conditions for that? And the conditions, unfortunately, are that they so decisively cleared the battlefield of their enemies that they now feel essentially unconstrained in their actions. And the function of those actions, sure, and we should recognize it, and this is a difference I have to somebody like Robert Brenner, is not simply expanded plunder. Right? That the hegemonic operation in 2020, 2021 is more complex than that. But it certainly has the effect of reinforcing existing and absolutely massive inequalities and perpetuating a system which is unstable, fragile, and we've now seen on multiple occasions capable of really quite massive breakdown. So that's what I'm trying to get at. In a sense, it is. It's again, there's an analogy to your argument about the end of history not meaning the beginning of the end of history not meaning the beginning of history again. In the sense, I'm saying the end of neoliberalism doesn't mean somehow the rebirth of social democracy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just leaves us in this broken ground, in which power, naked power, in the zones that I look at rather than zones of political discourse and political culture, in the zones of naked power that I look at, is in a sense even more unconstrained than before, which is where somebody like Robert Brenner gets off calling this a neo-feudalism, and which I also don't think quite gets it, because that to me is too retro. I think we need to recognise the new nature of this. But if you look at, say, EU restrictions on subsidies to corporates, normally those are the kind of sort of chastity belt, right, around European capitalism. So far and no further. Like you can cosset your businesses, but not more than this. All of that went. So it was just an uninhibited carnival of subsidies to corporate interest. And we dress this up to make ourselves feel better because we're saying we're protecting jobs, which you are up to a certain point, but you're also protecting shareholders. And, we talk about small and medium-sized business, which makes us feel better, but this is just another word for the petty bourgeoisie, right? Or indeed, in fact, lower levels of the bourgeoisie. Yeah. And the top 1% of the income distribution, or no, less than that, like fractions of 1% of the top half of the wealth distribution. And just being gigantic subsidy to that entire group, as never before. So when the rules break, when neoliberalism loses its ideological guilty conscience, we should not necessarily, rejoice, because it's not obvious what the next move then is, right? And it could be Bolsonaro, it could be God knows what, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something this segues into the next question, I suppose, and it's something you kind of build into the narrative of the book from the start, is the absence of an organized left and a working class as actually an explanatory factor in this enormously uneven response. And you talk about the US and the CARES Act, and you've already mentioned this huge upwards transfer of wealth. So, I mean, how important is the absence of a left in driving all of these responses, do you think?
Well, at the level of class dynamics, we've already just spoken about it, and it frames the possibility for the actions that are taken. And even I would say, the rescue plan that the Biden administration pushes through, it's absolutely classic 1990s, 2000s, well-targeted social policy from above, backed up by central bank action. Far better than nothing, don't get me wrong. And far better than CARES, which really was pork barrel politics for everyone. But that's the sort of politics that it is. The thing that preoccupied me most was, in a sense, the cognitive politics of this, because this is a crisis intellectually for neoliberalism. It's a triumph for the basic diagnosis of the Green New Deal. Absolute triumph, because it mapped the interconnection between the three things and said we need to understand the relationship between the fragility and unstable dynamics of capitalism, the inequality and social inequality this produces, and irreducibly the new threats that come from the environmental crisis that we're in. We all mistook what the immediate threat was going to be. We were all on climate and none of us were on emerging infectious diseases. But nevertheless, that diagnosis was fundamentally correct. And one of the things that happens is, in a sense, is that almost because of its political defeat in the form of Corbyn and Sanders, it opens it up for appropriation by the centrists. So this is again a point where I would differ with somebody like Brenner. What I see is something more, in a sense, not worrying, but like more dynamic, in that the centrists can break up and metabolize key elements of what was essentially a correct and critical diagnosis and subsume them. Daniela Gabor has this great phrase, revolution without revolutionaries. I quote the, Gatto Pardo, for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. This is the kind of moment that this is, right? This is LaSalle Bismarck, where the conservative figures can see the essential veracity and penetrating quality of a certain critique, can also exploit its de facto on-the-ground political weakness to absorb elements of that into an intellectual vacuum created by the breakdown of neoliberalism, right? So you can suck this stuff up and assimilate it.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced the condition of possibility of that is the defeat of the left, right? So I do have this little counterfactual, like, what if Bernie Sanders had been nominated? But I think, well, frankly, I think it's very difficult to call what would have happened, because I think it would have been so labile. The structures of the American Constitution, I do not think would have survived. Well, the suggestion of the text is that they might not have survived intact.
No, that's interesting. And I mean, I want to put a pin in this now, but we do want to come back to this question of Green New Deal and class politics a little bit later on. But for now, maybe you want to turn to focus on another area of the world. I wanted to focus on the shutdown in the developing world. So, I mean, you discussed Latin America quite a bit, Africa as well. But I mean, to focus on Latin America, its case was particularly grave. I mean, something that I experienced here. You know that it managed financial stabilization as this is as an example of the Wall Street consensus or the new toolbox. Yeah. But at the same time, obviously, it suffered huge COVID fatalities, especially in Ecuador and Peru, but as well in Brazil, and of course, very unequally borne. The human costs. But I guess the question what I'm getting to is that with hugely informal economies, the human and economic costs of lockdown were obviously devastating. And you also actually discussed India as an example where Modi's lockdown resulted in scenes that hadn't been seen since partition and the huge population movements that involved. So, I mean, how do you understand this paradox? How do you maybe try to resolve this paradox that the countries that seemingly needed strong measures to combat the pandemic the most were the ones that could least afford them, not just, financially, but maybe perhaps in human terms?
Well, I mean, in general terms, I mean, I think your diagnosis is absolutely right. I mean, in general terms, I think we think this is the alarming scenario that faces us in the age of the Anthropocene, right? That the countries most affected by global warming as well are those least well able to cope with it, with the least resources for adaptation, let alone mitigation. I mean, they don't, on the whole, generally contribute per capita anyway, a significant amount to the genesis of the problem, but they are in harm's way as it develops. So it's not, it's not for nothing that Kim Stanley Robinson's, vista of climate disaster in the future centers on a giant disaster in India as a result of a huge heat wave there. That is one of the scenarios that I think we anticipate unfolding over the next couple of decades. So I think that is the nature of the beast. And, what was surprising in a sense about 2020 is that the epidemic ran out of control so severely in the three great hubs of the global economy, so China, Europe, and the United States. The fact that it did run out of control in emerging and low-income countries is less surprising, but it is, appalling in its consequences.
That was always expected. You mentioned at one point in the book about how I think in that February period of wasting time when Western countries weren't taking action, that the EU was preoccupied, one, with new refugee influxes, and we're still thinking about pandemic worries as just being something about the global South, which doesn't really concern us. It's at most a humanitarian concern. And I think that's quite clear. But I mean, I guess what I'm getting at in the question that I asked was whether the fact that the need for perhaps a lockdown to stop the spread was just impossible in countries like Ecuador, for example, where informal economies meant that people had to go to work. So a lockdown was impossible. Whereas in countries with better healthcare systems, a lockdown was less necessary. So, I mean, isn't there a sort of paradox there?
Well, no healthcare system could. I mean, I take the conventional view that the lockdowns were absolutely essential, even in the rich countries, because their healthcare systems could not have coped without the social distancing measures. I actually think, in the limit, once an epidemic like this runs out of control, no one's healthcare system, it doesn't matter how large it is. I don't, in the book, actually emphasize strongly. I don't neglect it, but I don't emphasize strongly the way in which neoliberalism stripped the hospital systems down. Because in the end, once you have the exponential growth system going on, it really doesn't matter how large your hospital system is dimensioned, it will be overwhelmed. The striking thing about the emerging market economies is that they participated in the general push to lockdown in March and April, regardless of any local cost-benefit analysis. Right. So this is the really striking thing about India. It's not at all evident in retrospect that it was the right. I mean, it's clear in retrospect it was the wrong way to do whatever they were doing. It's not even obvious in retrospect that it was the right thing to do in the first place at the moment they did it, right? Because at the moment they implemented it, there really just wasn't much infection in India. So the really striking thing about it is, to my mind, the logic of incorporation that really says no one's life is too cheap, right? Absolutely every country in the world, bar a handful of small exceptions, participates in the lockdown process in March, because it just becomes a kind of mandatory action that all governments must take in the face of this global threat. To not take it really labels you as eccentric, weird, callous, disregarding of the interests of your population. It contributed crucially to the delegitimation of the Belarusian regime and the launch of the mass wave of protests which continue there all the way to the present day, is that the regime just appeared oblivious to the risks. So I don't find it difficult to understand that the emerging markets attempted to do these lockdowns, nor, however, is it difficult to understand that it was very difficult to maintain them for long enough for them to be as effective as one might have wished, given the, as you say, the huge informal sector. I mean, Latin America's total informal workforce is roughly on the same size of that as India. It's absolutely huge, in other words, once you look across national boundaries and treat the continent as a single block, or South America as a single block. So it's very difficult to maintain.
I think what's interesting is that in some ways this discussion is being forgotten, and maybe won't be fully had out about what could have been done differently, because the focus changed to vaccines, and that kind of remains the focus. Yes. So on the question of the vaccines, I mean, you note in the book that most governments around the world were engaged in unprecedented emergency spending that dwarfed the scale of the entire vaccine program. And at a separate moment, you also note the disproportion between the scale of the crisis and the scale of the means used to resolve it. So tens of trillions in damage, tens of billions on the vaccine, and even less on their efficient deployment and fair distribution. This is obviously left currently, as we're recording, billions unvaccinated in the developing world. How do you account for that disproportion? The costs of the lockdowns, and then not spending that much on actually vaccine distribution.
It is, I think, actually a really deep puzzle. I remark it, I highlight it, I stress it for emphasis, and because that is one of the critical points I want to make in the book, and I'd like that point to be heard. But to explain it is actually really quite difficult, because the cost-benefit ratio that the IMF has calculated is 180 to 1. I mean, it's staggering. It literally it contradicts any rational choice, or even just sort of basic. I mean, forget rational choice. Any kind of notion of self-interested action would suggest that any two, certainly any five of the richer members of the G20 could get together and easily justify the 50 billion that would be necessary to restart, to really genuinely roll out a fully comprehensive vaccination program and reap these spectacular benefits. It's very difficult to understand how that could happen, other than, and it's what would be the corporate interest. The patent argument which is being used by the left on this issue doesn't work. That isn't the constraint. The constraint is productive capacity and rolling out know-how in an embodied form, and having envisioned from the start the vaccine programs at the necessary scale. So only the ill-fated AstraZeneca vaccine was from the very beginning conceived of as something that was going to be outsourced to the Serum Institute and produced at the relevant scale, right? The mRNA ones were always much more boutique, smaller projects. And so, I mean, you end up saying something quite banal, and I think in the end one has to say it, which is that there is a disconnect, and I do say this in the book, a disconnect between the ability of the ruling elites, to just use that kind of crude term, to comprehend the scale of action that is necessary to manage the globalized world that they have made, right? So this is, as it were, a different sort of disconnect. I mean, you describe very brilliantly in your book the sort of blindness of that elite to what democracy actually means, and where their enemies might come from and why they hate us and all of these sorts of silly questions that they ask. But this is of a rather different order. This is literally $10 trillion in checks lying around on the street that no one has the imagination to pick up.
Yeah,
and it is quite staggering, especially alongside the other things that have been done. So then you end up saying maybe we should reverse this. What is it that enables the truly spectacular things to be done? And the answer, I think, there is in the end a more productive line of thought, which is to say, what enables the truly spectacular things to be done is the well-trodden path of fiscal and monetary policy coordination and the existing globalized network of finance and the existing and powerfully interconnected network of central bank expertise. And within that circuit, as it were, you can go from billions to tens of billions to hundreds of billions to trillions without anyone really batting an eyelid. But it's a well-greased track that we travel on in doing that, and it's exclusive, privileged, reproduces inequality. We do not have that kind of network for global public health, despite the efforts of billionaire philanthropists to build it. It's all remained at a scale that's too small. But in terms of normative conclusions, if we are to have a chance of managing any of these crises going forward, the sort of politics I'm interested in, which is very much inside this machine of governance, has got to be about expanding those kind of networks. What are the bargains necessary to interest the really big pharma companies in building networks that will enable us to do those kind of vaccine programs at scale in a matter of 3 or 4 months rather than 2 or 3 years?
So moving to those financial institutions you've mentioned, you've argued in the book and elsewhere that central banks have been victims of their own success in keeping inflation down. What does that mean?
Well, the great struggle of the 70s and 80s was inflation. And the world that we're in now, the great struggle of central bank policy is that we're in a world of what's called lowflation and stagflation.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of different explanations for this. Including, most significantly, the bolting on of several 100 million manual workers in Asia onto the global supply chain system network, which totally shifted the balance of force between capital and labour. Aging populations, which changed the dynamics of saving and consumption.
Yeah.
Better central bank policy, which the central bankers pat themselves on the back for, and in the age of the great moderation used to claim credit for, that they've got much better at their job. Yeah. And in the background, of course, lurks the theme that we were discussing earlier on, which is that the central thrust of central bank politics in the 80s, anyway, was to break what they understood to be a dangerous cycle between wages and prices, which in its guts was driven by the ability of organized labor to push back against rising price levels and demand wage indexation or higher wages. Yeah. Classically in somewhere like Italy, but in much of Latin America as well. And they snapped that link by either direct class struggle means, in the sense of the Thatcher government breaking the National Union of Miners and Mine Workers in Britain, which was an ongoing 15-year struggle between the Tory party and that part of the British working class, but more generally through the kind of cosh of a huge interest rate shock engineered by Paul Volcker in the Federal Reserve from 1979. Yeah. Again, with quite explicit, Volcker is as unapologetic in arguing that inflation needs to be broken both by macroeconomic means and by breaking the power of organised labour on the other side.
So how are they victims of that regime then?
Well, you become a victim because then all of a sudden it turns out that your macroeconomic management problem was of one type when you were trying to avoid inflation, and becomes another sort of problem when you've got deflation, because for highly leveraged, in other words, indebted economies, deflation is much more terrifying than inflation, because if you just imagine, if you are lucky enough to own a house, and imagine if the value of the house fell in half and your mortgage wouldn't adjust. And so that avoiding that kind of cycle of debt deflation is really the central preoccupation of macroeconomic policy back to the Great Depression. And that's what they now struggle with. And it's very difficult for them to, in fact, engender energetic increases in prices.
So you've mentioned the disproportion, I suppose, or the asymmetry between these tremendously sophisticated global financial networks and central banks and so on, and the absence of that in the public health equivalent. Mm-hmm. So I wondered maybe if you have any thoughts about what the long-term implications are of these central banks and these kind of technocratic institutions par excellence being so powerful. What does the future of the world look like with these institutions having been strengthened by the pandemic?
Well, it depends it's a difficult question to answer just straight out, to be honest. It's prospective, it's futuristic. What we have seen at times in Europe, depending on the sort of policy pursued, but an austerity policy pursued in the name of that kind of technocracy easily collects enemies against itself. And I think one of the lessons learned from that experience after 2010, on the part, say, of the people who run the German finance ministry under Olaf Scholz, is that it's better to avoid that. Yeah. Because managing Italy's politics under the cosh of austerity is terrifyingly dangerous for the Eurozone. And on the other hand, if you then do what's necessary, in other words, the ECB activates and buys bonds, and now Italy and Greece can borrow at negative interest rates over the medium-term time horizon, if you do it loudly, you face a right-wing populist mobilization. The AfD in Germany is, after all, originally an anti-Euro party, an anti-Draghi party, which is also a problem. And conservative institutions of state, like the German Supreme Court, will take cases by people like the AfD, which will make it quite difficult for you to carry on this sort of smooth, under-the-counter technocratic management of that crisis. So avoiding those two equally unattractive scenarios has become how elites in Europe, at least, are managing this situation. And I take them to be a particularly, it's a real petri dish of this kind of politics. It doesn't, but this goes to one of your themes, right? I mean, you could say, oh, my Lord, and when you spell this out to German journalists, they say, but how are we ever going to stabilize this? Yeah. And to which my response is, folks, wake up, smell the coffee. Yeah. That's one of those fantasies that you describe so nicely in your book, when politics ends through the achievement of all of its goals, right? Yes. This isn't that kind of a problem. This is the sort of problem which is with you forever. Yeah. So if we can manage it for the foreseeable future using this kind of delicate balancing act, we'll take that, thank you very much. Because the alternatives of trying to create an order through some sort of write down of all of the debts or Italy leaving the Eurozone are certainly, in my judgment, infinitely worse. Yeah. So we have to. There's all sorts of good German words. We're driving with very low visibility, but we're just picking our way, as it were, through the fog here.
So we've got another kind of very basic and prospective question, I suppose, as a follow-on. So, and part of the wider picture into which the book slots, I suppose, you've got growing geopolitical rivalry, competition for green energy raw materials, all these post-pandemic efforts to reshore various critical production and supply chains and so on. So does this mean globalization is over?
No, I think the short answer to that is no. I think the globalization is over discourse is unhelpful. Yeah. Measured in certain terms, like trade, it, at least for a while, looked as though it has plateaued in terms of the share of trade in GDP, or to put that better, the value of trade benchmarked against GDP has been, broadly speaking, static since 2010, which means that exports aren't growing any faster than GDP. So the trade share of the economy is not expanding. It's static, however, and it's at the level it was, at peak globalization. So that's something. Many people, the smart people who think about this, say basically what's happening is that there's a reconfiguration of relationships within that system. More and more interaction of a remote variety, the sort of conversation that us folks are having right now on this Zoom call, is a form of globalization, right? I mean, you're in Britain, Alex is in Brazil, I'm in the United States. This is as about as global an event as you could possibly ask for.
Yeah.
And but of course, it doesn't involve any of us traveling around and won't show up necessarily in trade as a share of GDP. And then I think we also have to think of of conflict and geopolitical conflict as not necessarily counterposed to globalization, right? But as a product of it, a modulation of it, another way of articulating it. New alliances, new intensities of interaction will be shaped through conflict. I once wrote a rather venturesome article with a great friend and colleague of mine, Ted Furtick, in which we insisted that, even World War I was not the end of globalization, but in fact a modulation and a reformatting of it.
Yeah.
If you think about the intensity of interactions between the Allies in a war, they massively intensify, right? So even if you look at something like Afghanistan right now, a substantial slice of the Afghani population is being globalized as we speak by air, from airplanes, flown around the world. So I think I would think of it in those terms. No, I mean, I've always liked, and this goes back a long way now for me intellectually, goes back to Charlie Bright and Michael Geyer's phrase, which is the global condition. In other words, we live in a global condition, a condition of globality. Globalizations and various phases of that will come and go, will take different forms, but the condition of interconnectedness is just not, it's not reversible, it's not something you can exit.
Yeah. So, I mean, Adam, just to pick up on something you said just 2 minutes ago, but you seem to suggest that more dislocation would be needed to drive some sort of political resolution to this internal crisis, that, this is only the beginning. 2020 is only the beginning, really. Might not something like, for example, Italy leaving the Eurozone, even crashing out of the Eurozone, be exactly that it might provide a possibility for the future, both for Italy, most obviously, but also perhaps to provide that dislocation necessary to drive some new political imagination?
Well, I mean, I know people are tempted by this idea that, there's a bunch of people in Syriza in Greece in 2015 who were tempted by this idea. The reason why it wasn't actualized is that, looked at closely, the real consequences of doing something like that in terms of people's welfare are just so dramatic that it's very difficult for somebody with a deep sense of historic responsibility to choose something like that. So I think, and I know people on the left are deeply frustrated with that, and will denounce somebody like Tsipras forever as a result of his decision to opt that way. But you won't, you won't be surprised to hear that I actually have a great deal of sympathy for that choice on his part. The opposite proposition, at least within the Eurozone, has not been tested. And so it's quite easy to uphold it as a hypothetical alternative when we've not actually seen what its consequences are. And on the other hand, we have seen the pain and the frustration that staying within the Eurozone causes. So there's a bias in the evidence, the arguments that are available to folks. It seems to me far more likely that a country like Italy might accidentally crash out of the Eurozone than that anyone in their right mind would deliberately take it out, because the redenomination of the balance sheets, everyone's debts, everyone's assets in a society as complex and as large as Italy is frankly hair-raising. And again, I know enough about the history of revolution and counter-revolution and social democracy to know that exactly this kind of argument was made in the Weimar Republic against Luxembourg and the Bolshevik left in Germany, that Germany was too sophisticated a country and it was too complex. And there's in fact, I think, even rather a brilliant passage by either Lenin or Trotsky on the bourgeois ideology of complexity and how it's always invoked. I think it was one of the Bernsteins who invoked complexity as an argument against revolution in Germany. Maybe it was Rosenberg. So, there's a lineage here, and this argument has been going on, and we should recognize the positions that we're occupying in it. And that is the position that I would take, which is that this is this is potentially utterly catastrophic, by which I mean destroying of millions of jobs, laying waste to an entire social system, condemning people to decades of even worse outcomes than they currently face. This argument in no way relies on excusing or making any apology for the way the Eurozone works de facto. And what it suggests as the most likely outcome is really quite miserable. In other words, that underperforming, to use the euphemism, parts of the Eurozone remain locked within it because the choice of leaving it is even worse. And that is a recipe for dissatisfaction, which is why, as far as I can see, the only way of coping with this is to hive off the risks onto the bank balance sheet of the central bank in ways which don't antagonize the Northern European conservatives. So this is in no way a Pollyannish affirmation of the realities of the Eurozone. I've spent enough time in Italy recently to know how miserable the outlook can be, especially for younger people there. But it is. I am impressed by the risks involved in that strategy, and as I say, therefore, it seems most likely to come about as a result of a sort of accident. I don't think anyone in Italy will be foolish enough to kind of conduct the kind of referendum that Cameron called in the UK, And were it to happen, I think it's quite possible that the radical circumstances that would result might indeed open up the possibilities for politics and agency, but they would be bought, as you know, from my view, at an extraordinarily high price.
Hi, listener. The final part of our interview with Adam Tooze can be found over on Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast, where we'll continue discussing whether an off-ramp to the EU should be taken, as well as the lack of a revolutionary subject today, money printer go brrr, and the Federal Reserve's emerging role as a global central bank, plus climate change and class politics. Coming up on BungaCast over the next month, we've got a big 5-part series on generations, examining generational conflict from the 19th century to the 21st. We ask what's behind the resurgence in generational consciousness today, from the OK Boomer memes to Generation Rent, and ask what the impact of the pandemic will be on Gen Z. Also, we'll be discussing the moral panic over incels, plenty on Germany's upcoming election, and our monthly reading club will discuss the roots of intersectionality in 1930s Stalinism and 1970s Maoism. All that and more. We'd love for you to join us. It's at patreon.com/bungacast. That's it from us for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.